Hello and welcome everyone in another episode of Researchers Celebrity powered by Empowering Science Foundation. Today we are fortunate enough to have Professor Ethan Bier with us, and I can assure all the audience from starting, this is going to be research, philosophy, and everything you live every day. So with this small, I wanted to say thank you, Ethan, for taking time out for this platform. And Professor Ethan has done his bachelor's in dual major in biology and mathematics. And then he did his postdoc, a brief postdoc at UCSF. And since then, he joined University of California, San Diego, and still working at the same place. Ethan, welcome at the platform.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Ethan, we start our conversation having like how and when you decided that you wanted to be a researcher.
Well, that's a kind of interesting question. You'd think it's a simple answer, but it isn't. Because the truth is when I was younger, I didn't really think of being a researcher, honestly. I was always interested in science. So when I was a kid, I trapped animals and studied them. I didn't hurt them. I looked at them. I measured turtle shells to see how they grew as they got bigger. And I was always fascinated by science. But, my education was largely provided by my father, who was a literature professor. And so much of my education was kind of in the humanities, although he also taught me algebra and things like that. But then when I went to college, my primary, as you pointed out, my primary major was in math. And so I'd kind of thought more along that kind of line, math or physics or so forth. And then as I kind of got to the end of it, I was also taking some biology classes because I was interested in that as well, and all through my life, but up to that point. And then I just kind of decided, I was going to go into biology. My parents wanted me to go to medical school because, that's what many Jewish parents think that's a good thing for their kids. And I just really couldn't face being a doctor. I don't like blood, so blood freaks me out. So that was a real negatory there. And also, it just didn't seem like I'd enjoy that career. And although, certainly doctors do pretty well from the financial point of view, I think that was one of the decisions I made that was good for me personally, because I think I would have probably not flourished as well in that. So I just made a decision toward the very end of college. And in fact, a faculty member at UCSD, Darwin Berg, who's still here, is the one who kind of talked me into applying to graduate school. So I did. I'd had no lab experience. And I'm surprised that they accepted me, really, not having any lab experience, but they did. And after a while, and I was working in the lab, I thought, yeah, this is good. I mean, I kind of like this. And so it then went from that to, a variety of experiences that took me eventually to, my postdoctoral work using fruit flies. One of the big things I had in graduate school is I took some time late in my graduate career to take a genetics class a bacterial genetics class from John Beckwith. And I'd taken a little bit of bacterial genetics in the early classes that you're supposed to take in your first year or two. And I was pretty interested in that. And that just was riveting to me, the class with Beckwith. And actually it really prepared me for the rest of my experiences that involved some of the times when you were in the lab, which was that he had a very strong emphasis on integrating science and ethics. And so in his case, it was gene cloning. And he was the first person through using bacterial genetics that essentially isolated through, phage transduction, a gene. And, you could claim, you'd say, the first cloning of a gene. And in fact, he wrote a book, Making Genes, Making Waves, that, makes that point. And then as a consequence of that, he understood that was something that had to be communicated to the larger public. And so he put a huge amount of effort in that. So in his class, he kind of integrated those things. And I thought that was interesting and very forward looking. And so, in fact, when I went back at whatever it was 2016, I was invited to give a talk back there at Harvard Medical School where he was still present. I asked to see him so that I could thank him for what he had done in preparing me for my own, sort of engagement with that issue, as our work on gene drives intersected very heavily with an ethical social impact component, which, as you know, when you were in the lab, having come with from the Tata Institute for Genetics and Society initiative, there was this big S part of it, the society part, that you contributed to as well, and as well as all the other folks that were part of that process. And it was, I think, a very important component, and something that is very much, in my mind, a very important thing for all scientists to think about is, what are the ethical underpinnings of what you're doing, and are you comfortable with what you're doing? So I credit that, at least initially, to having been confronted with that from John Beckwith's class. But from that point on, I kind of got interested in genetics, and so I went on to postdoc in fruit flies, and then fruit flies. I love fruit flies, and so then I started my own lab doing those, and then that's what I've done most of the time, except that eventually the gene drive research moved itself into a neighboring species, mosquitoes. And so it's expanded in that sense a little bit. But overall, I feel very fortunate that I got exposed to genetics when I did, and that it's been a pleasure to think about things. And in a certain sense, genetics is a biological correlate of math in a way. It's kind of a very mathematical thing. It's the flow of genetic information, and it's you can see it in the same way in certain regards that you see sort of mathematical relationships. So in a certain sense, I think I'm suited maybe for that kind of niche in biology.
So we have heard success stories whenever a mathematician comes into biology, the way they transform the field, as is known for all the viewers who don't know. Professor Ethan Bier is the person whose lab gene drive, the concept of gene drive, active genetics, and these things actually started. And he's the one who termed the who coined the term active genetics. So when I was trying, so I thought that, okay, let's prepare for something. And I was like, who termed this coin active genetics? And apparently Professor Bier is the person. So there are so many things coming up now. When you were planning to do applications for the graduate schools, mathematics being the first love, biology obviously your interest were, what made you thought that you should apply to mostly the biology but not hard like for mathematics and physics and other interests?
Well, there are two things there. First of all, just to be honest, the people who are successful at math are really, really good at it. And I saw some professors, for example, in algebra, who would just know the theorems and write them out like from their head on the board, where for me, with some effort, I could struggle and figure it out maybe, but not like just writing it like that, like it's coming off the top of your head, like language. I mean, for them, it's innate, and it's almost, I think. So I think there's an element of talent that is in a mathematician that is like music. It's an innate ability, and I'm okay, but not like that. And the other thing is I don't know if you've ever read The Defense by Vladimir Nabokov. It's one of my favorite books, but in there he describes a chess player who becomes absolutely obsessed, as many chess players are. And, chess is like a real mathematical thing, right? So he becomes completely obsessed with chess, and he becomes so obsessed with it that it takes over his brain, and he goes down into the abyss of craziness. He completely loses his mind to that obsession. That obsession just completely controls him. And I was worried that it might do that to me, because I would spend time thinking about problems where nothing else was in my mind at all. And after a while, I thought, I'm not sure this is healthy long-term. This might not lead to good things. And so the combination of the two, and then I also thought biology was really getting exciting. Seemed like interesting questions were possibly on the horizon, like how did the brain work, the nervous system work? And that seemed like really an interesting thing that was a little easier to do. I mean, I know not an easy thing to do, but easier than math and or physics. And so even though I really appreciated those harder ends of the sciences, and I still do, I still think they're fascinating. I felt that it'd be probably a better use of me to do something like biology, where, it'd be something I could I could handle perhaps.
Nice. So in our conversation, if I'm right, I still remember that you still solve some mathematical equations these days also.
Well, simple ones, yeah. I mean, one of the fun things, I have to admit, was when we got the gene drives. I loved infinite series, and so you have recursion formulas as one example of infinite series, and so I wrote out the appropriate recursion formulas for gene drives and full gene drives and split gene drives, and with a little help from a mathematician here at UCSD, he helped me figure out how to solve the one for the full gene drives. I was able to do the one for the split gene drives on my own, but yeah, I got to get back to that and sort of, revisit those mathematical relationships and so forth. But I think, in the end, it's a kind of mental perspective, math and genetics, and of course, active genetics was just so much fun from that point of view, is fundamentally of a mathematical nature. The relationships between it's the frequency with which it is in the population and number of generations and so forth. I mean, it's all very mathematical. And then, how things would combine, and would they scale together, or, what is the essence of really, when you come right down to the essence of a Cas9 guide RNA full gene drive versus a split drive, what is it really as a mathematical object? I think, that was fun to kind of get to see that.
So Ethan, when you were applying for grad schools, science has taken so many transformations over these many decades. And you are one of them now, probably, who also contributed to this transformation from Mendelian genetics to active genetics. If I have to ask you a question, that what is the role of PhD or the graduate school in a life of a researcher?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's changed, as maybe you're suggesting, over time. If you go back to the early days, it was a very much of a rigid formality. And, it still is in some places in Europe. And then you have to write, after that, you have to write a habilitation before you actually get your full kind of job. So it's kind of a rite of passage. And it's, making sure that you're going to fit into the scientific edifice of the time. And I think from that point of view, it was almost serving like a guild-like function, in the sense of limiting the number of people that are in the different positions, because you'd have the professor on the top of all the lower ones that would, in that sort of European hierarchy anyway, that would be there forever, and only after that person passed on, would somebody else rise to the top to become that apical sort of hierarchical leader. And I think what happened in the United States, where things were breaking up a little bit from that point of view, is that more and more that it became a matter of training and getting you prepared for, as fast as possible, getting your own career going. And then, there were times back, in the 50s where you go straight from a PhD to having a job. You go right to it. And so I think it's kind of, changed as time's gone on. But over the course of my own career, I think it's probably become more and more of a staging period, where what you really need to do, I think, as a graduate student now, is find a suitable mentor that helps you connect your head to your hands. At least in biology, where it's still fundamentally an experimental science. In other sciences, I can't really give an opinion, but in biology, that seems to me to be the essence of what you do in graduate school. It doesn't matter whether it has anything to do with what you're going to do in the future. I don't think it really does. It just training for how to, it's like playing the piano in a little bit, in a bit of the way. I mean, you've got your hands, you've got your brain, and you understand, you've heard the music, but it just takes a lot of practice to make what's in your head come out from your hands. And I think that's really what graduate school is good for, is taking bright people and hooking up their heads to their hands so they understand what is practically possible based on their ideas. So it's great to have all these imaginative ideas, but then in the end, only a small fraction of those are actually going to work when you realize that there are all these practical considerations, quantitative things like, how much of the molecule is there? Can you purify it? Well, it'll take 5 billion cows. Well, there's not 5 billion cows. And so, what are you going to do? You have to think of a different way to do it then. Or though in some cases, the people have done those kinds of purifications where they have lots of material they start off with and then they purify it. But it's those kinds of practical things. Are things going to get stuck on the column? Are you going to be able to clone the gene? How many genes are there? Will you be able to make a mutant? What fraction of the time would you get a mutant? All of those kinds of those practical things that are easy to just write off if you're just thinking about it, you have to really face as a graduate student. And then I think when you feel yourself prepared that, yeah, I can do this now, then it's time to go take a postdoctoral position where you really are launching, hopefully, the direction that you're going to want to go on in your career. Because from the postdoc, you do kind of generally move into at least the first phase of your own independent work. And so it certainly makes sense to have that kind of be a kind of linear tracking, at least at the beginning.
Nice. So this is something which I always try to convey in these conversations to all the audience, that PhD is a training, as Dr. Bier also mentioned. This trains you for the rest of your life, and you should be very logical sometime, because everyone knows the way PhD student starts their PhD, and when it finishes, their life also changes, be mentally or scientifically, obviously. But there are so many changes which happens in every single PhD. The dream when a PhD student applies and admits themselves to a PhD graduate program, and when they complete, this journey is what trains you for the rest of your life. Now, coming to the second phase of researcher, as Dr. Bier just said right now, about the postdocs. And here I would like to ask that what you suggest for our postdoctoral researchers, that how important is to start early collaborations and networking.
Well, that's an interesting question, Raja. The most important thing, I think, is that you get your own work done, and that you come up with a coherent and impactful story. And that's very stressful on its own, as you know, just to get that done in that relatively short period of time. But you raise an important point, though, in that it may well have been true, perhaps in my time, that's more or less all you really had to do. Because most papers, if you looked at them at that time, had the name of the person who was doing most of the work and the name of the senior author in whose lab the work was being done, and maybe one or two other people who did a little bit. But now, if you look at a lot of papers, you see, 2 or 3 co-first authors and 10 or so authors that have done something, to contribute to the study, because so much more has to be done in collaborative engagements. And so I think now it is more important, and probably not as a graduate student yet, but as a postdoc, yes, because it helps train you for and prepare you for what you're going to need to be able to do on your own, which I do believe, to be a successful scientist in today's world, you do have to be collaborative, and it makes life a lot more interesting on top of everything to do so. But I think it may have been more optional in the past to have that view, and now I think it's pretty much necessary. So yes, I think it is good. And then the dynamic of, well, who sets up the collaborative tone, the PI, which of course has some responsibility, hopefully, to do that, or the postdoc themselves. And I think probably the healthy balance is a combination of the two, where at least the PI provides some initial introductions and the context for the successful interactions, and then the postdoc engages in them and interacts with people from other labs and other PIs even, and maybe goes out and finds some other PIs on their own to talk to. So it's perfectly okay, at least in my group lab, it's fine, to think about it that way. And so I think that's probably true. It's probably an important component now. Probably not the most important. The most important is still getting your work done, yes, but it's up there as something you should be able to do. I don't think, for example, that it's that important as a postdoc to be writing grants. I think that's something that the PIs, of course, really love, is when people get fellowships, and it is helpful. I don't mean to say it's not, but it's not as important in the sense that you'll learn how to do that. I mean, you have to learn how to write, you have to know how to write, you have to know how to do that. You write papers. When you're writing papers, you're going through that process. And so the next step of writing grants is a kind of natural extrapolation of that, but it's not as immediately clear what the transition is to setting up collaborations. And so to have that as a mindset, that that's an important thing to do, I think it's good at the level of postdocs. Yeah, I would say that's important.
Nice. So now let's, you just mentioned about grant writing and publications. Now, in this present scenario, the science is changing every single day. Every single day you have publications because there is so many number of journals which are coming up almost every day. Second, because of the technology, the peer review process is so fast. I am sure that you, in like just 2-3 decades from now, when it was, you used to probably people used to type the paper, send it via mail, and then get comments. And it was like more than a year of work to just publish the manuscript which you have ready today. Now, right. Yes, now with this change, what are your opinions about publishing in high impact factor journals?
Yeah, well, I have a mixed feeling, to be honest, about high impact journals. Obviously, it makes sense from your own point of view of satisfaction to be doing work that other people are interested in. And so if the work is very interesting, you'd have potentially an opportunity to publish it in those high profile journals. And so that relationship between the work and the journal, I would call healthy. Okay. So I'd have nothing against publishing good work in high profile journals. It's fine. However, high profile journals on their own have some drawbacks on them. So for example, if you just simply ask, how likely is a story to be true, really true? Like, yes. Is it something that somebody thought, oh, that's cool, and they got it really published quickly? And it's not like they tried to make a mistake, but they did. And so how often does that happen in a high profile journal versus a more, I would call, solid tier level journal? It's definitely happening at higher rates in the higher profile journals, because of course people are pushed to do it, and the editors are, gung-ho to get the top story and so forth. So it's a little bit of that news media glitzing component to it, which I don't much care for. And I don't think that is helping science, that aspect of it. However, it's also important for people when they move on with their careers. If you want to get a job coming out of a postdoc, you probably need 1 or 2 papers in those journals to be considered, because, there are 300-400 people applying for a given job. They've all got those papers. So if you don't, you've got to have done something else that is pretty amazing. Otherwise, people will think, well, why should they, invite you versus one of these people who has those papers? So it's a tension there. And so I think the thing to do is just to recognize the reality that it's fun to get good data that goes into those fancy journals. That's just, a healthy relationship right there. And 2, you need it. So that's good to do it. But then on the other hand, to be a bit wary about the whole thing and to make sure that you don't fall into the trap yourself that some people do, getting too obsessed with publishing only in those journals. And so, you know, for example, there's some forms of support for researchers that expect that you only publish in journals like that, pretty much, and anything that's not in those journals doesn't really count. The NIH isn't like that. And for me, I'm more comfortable with the situation where, you know, as long as you're publishing good work, that's what you need to be judged on, and to get your funding and to keep your job and all that. If you're expecting that people only publish in those top tier journals, I think that's a distortion and unnatural imposition on a scientist, and it doesn't help creativity at that level. So I think it's, you know, you have to kind of put it in its perspective of where it's useful, those top journals, and where they're just providing potential unnecessary stress and changing the way people think about their own work. And I think that's where I would say there's a potential for an unfortunate, and tragedy is probably an overstatement, but where a person gets so obsessed with making sure that they're always publishing in those top journals that they actually don't do the work that they kind of would like to do, because they're so worried that if it's not going to get published in one of those journals that it won't count. And so they just stop looking at things that maybe they should, you know, sit back and be a little calmer and take the time to deeply investigate something that they know intuitively is interesting. And, you know, that what I'm in favor of is every possible sort of external stimulus that helps people develop the most out of their creative thoughts, and to translate those creative ideas into, you know, successful experiments that then reveal pieces of nature that were unknown before. And it's not always a linear path. I mean, if you look at, you know, the original story about how CRISPR got found, it got found in a, you know, in a dairy facility for people who were just trying to make sure that, you know, the bacteria weren't being killed by phage, and there was something that was preventing that. And so then, you know, the story, of course, took off with some brilliant people getting involved in and developing that system. And even in our own lab, in a much more modest case, you know, Valentino Gantz, that brilliant graduate student that I was so fortunate to have, that, you know, initiated that all that active genetics work and created those first gene drives. You know, he was working at the time on a problem that was so esoteric. You know, work from my lab in developmental biology had shown that the second wing vein of the fruit fly is determined by a gene that encodes a transcription factor called CNRPS that's expressed in a single stripe that makes that single vein. And the hypothesis that we'd entertained is that based on where that gene gets turned on in other insects that have more veins, that same gene might get turned on in two places. And in fact, he found that that is true in another insect. And that the hypothesis would be that if you mutated the gene in that organism, you'd lose two veins, whereas in the Drosophila, you only lose one. That was, you know, how many people care about that? And I, you know, sometimes in the seminar, I say there were 4 people who would probably care about it, and 2 of them were Valentino and me, you know. But nonetheless, it was a pain in the neck to get that to happen. You know, even though he's very good at everything he did, Valentino had golden hands, but even, you know, with his talents, prodigious talents, that wasn't so easy to get done. And so he came up with this idea, and, you know, then from that was born all of the fruits of active genetics. And so I think that's what's important about, in my mind, about science and the funding of science and the publication in journals that support that science, is that in the end, it all works as a whole to support that kind of possibility, where you're trying to do something that not that many people care about, but you personally think it's an interesting question. And then in the course of doing that, you might discover something else that's really profound, or at least has a huge or significant impact on the world of science. And I think, you know, the place of where those high profile journals fit in that is ambiguous. And I think it's important for people to both appreciate them, because certainly, you know, some of those editors are really fine editors, and they can, if they work with you, they can end up making a paper really very good, and they have some of the best editors, they do. And so that's the good side. On the other side, though, people who become obsessed, you know, with publishing there, I think there is the possibility of that getting in the way of doing the work they would actually really prefer to do.
So this brings us to a very interesting point, that obsession for publication and interest or your research interest. Sometimes, whenever they are not in sync, I think that is the only time when a researcher feels stress. And I want your thoughts about it. Like, if a researcher is going through stress, what, according to you, are the possible three top reasons or triggers for that stress?
Well, Raja, in the end, it's a lot of it's practical, right? I mean, so number one, you have to have money to do your work. So if
Yes.
you don't get your grants, then that's a big problem. How do you get your grants? Well, that's complicated too, but one important component, which I think still is a very solid component of it, is what have you published? So the publication then fits very much into what you're going to get in terms of those grants. So then the other stress comes from, well, are you in a competitive kind of project? And so are you going to be able to publish in a good journal, or is somebody else going to beat you to the punch? And if they do, then they might be the one who gets the grants and so forth. So those practical issues, and also, the impact on the people in your lab. If, they win, it's better. If they don't, then if they don't. And I've never been somebody who's really likes competition that much. I don't enjoy it. I mean, you have to do it. I mean, it's part of the world, it's part of life. But to me, that isn't an end in itself. Whereas, for some people, it kind of is part of the fun. I mean, that's okay. And that's not just that way for me personally. I don't find that particularly enjoyable. But so those are where the stresses come from. I think where the real world that is impacting whether you get to do your work or not, how that impacts how you get to actually do your work. In the best of all possible worlds, where you're assured you can do your work, then I think there'd be almost no stress, because then you just do what you want to do, and that's fine. So the stress comes in as kind of the real world making you, at least be attuned to what you have to do to, score the various achievements that you need, succeed in the various achievements you need to keep your work going. And in general, under good funding circumstances, that isn't so terrible. You're onerous. I mean, there are ups and downs, and those ups and downs are stressful. There's no doubt about that. But overall, over the longer arc of one's career, those things kind of even out. And if you're constantly engaged in paying attention, consistently engaged in paying attention and enjoying what you're doing, my guess is, if you have, good competence in what you're doing, things will go pretty well most of the time. It's not 100% though, because it's always, that there's an element of chance to it. I mean, I think that's the other thing too, that people often don't appreciate in any aspect of life, but certainly in science, is the role of chance. And people who want to credit themselves for how things go when things go well, or and not recognize the important role of chance, or who then maybe just blame chance when things don't go well, that's the other side of it. I think the reality is that anytime something goes well, you're lucky, and you should be appreciative of that. And when things don't, doesn't necessarily mean that you're a fool. It means that you just have to think a little harder about what you need to do to get past it. And the most important thing is not to lose hope, never to give up. So I think that's my sort of feeling on that, is the sort of personal mindset of never giving up, ever, under any circumstances. Never give up. And then if you have that, and then a reasonable, balanced sense of your accomplishments, and the humility to accept that if things go well, you've also had good luck, then I think then you're in pretty good shape.
Absolutely. So for all the audience here, Professor Ethan, I will start it or rephrase it in a way. Never give up should be the attitude when you commit yourself to research. Then the observation, obviously, research, be in any field, observation is the key. It's not only for the success of your experiments, it is, as Dr. Ethan just mentioned right now, it's about, there are hurdles, you have to surpass them. overcome all of those, and that is the way for your success, which you only have to walk on. There are always mentors. I was fortunate enough to have Ethan in my life, and whatever I am today, I can't say a lot, but significant. 80% I can say the significant is because of Professor Ethan Bier.
Well, that's
Now,
awfully kind of you, Raj. I don't know about that. But
the
okay.
question for you is like, from your graduate days till now, the evolution of a researcher within you, if you have to explain that.
Well, I don't know if this will answer your question, but the way I see it is that to a first approximation, once you've reached your 20s, you're kind of a defined human being. And then from that point on, you can kind of think of that human unit transiting their life experiences in their career from being a young junior person to an intermediate career person to being a later stage career person. And the essence of it is that at every point, you're still the same person, but you have different perspectives. When you're starting off, you don't know really what to do. So you're really bright, you're full of energy, you got a lot of ideas, but you're not quite sure how to do it. By the time you reach your middle period, you've kind of figured out hopefully how to do it. You still have a lot of energy, but maybe not yet quite the wisdom of seeing the bigger pictures and how the work that you're doing might interdigitate with and fit with what everybody else is doing. Hopefully you've got that to some degree, but maybe not quite the same perspective you get when you get a little bit older. When you get older, your brain doesn't work nearly as well, but you do have that experience to kind of weigh things against and judge, is this interesting? I mean, Yunung Jan, for example, my advisor as a postdoc, his first question when we come in to ask him something, he said, is it interesting? That's number one. Is it interesting? If it's not interesting, yeah, you can do it, but why? Don't waste your time doing it if it's fundamentally not interesting. And so your judgment of, is it interesting? I mean, of course, that's a weighted question. There are a million things that one person who thinks is interesting, another person can't. But to a certain extent, there is a deep answer to that question that doesn't depend so much on the person. It has to do with what is the impact that will have on science. Quite a few people have referred to this as the deletion experiment. If they take you out of the picture and the ideas that you had in your mind are no longer being acted on, what effect would that have on the trajectory of science in your time? If it has absolutely no effect at all, then the questions that you're answering perhaps aren't that important. If it had an impact, then perhaps you are. And so, that's a very subjective and a kind of loaded way of thinking about it. But nonetheless, to a first approximation, I think it does make you think. It's not just what you can do, is it worth doing? Are you going, if it works, are you going to be in a position where you know a lot more than you did now? Are you going to be happy that you did that? Or are you just going to have added one more little brick in the procedure? And that's okay. There are times when you do have to just put bricks together to get to a point where you can now look over and see something. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing either, to have a part of what you do is just putting the bricks down. But the bigger view is what matters. And are you making a difference in how people think about things? And are you helping move the way forward of progress, and progress in every different sense of it, the enlightenment and the enthusiasm and the potential for the future to, reveal itself as it might?
Ethan, just adding the philosophical part to this question. We had this conversation about invention of wheel, of fire, that if someone will not do, someone else in somewhere is doing that. And that is something which has been seen all over the science or philosophy or economics or anything about humanity, what we have seen this. If we add that here, obviously, like with all the due respect, the diligence, this question is about what we call as a significant change. Was that discovery of DNA structure? Before that, there was science. It added after that model came in. Then people started talking about genes later on. You took it to next level. You did it. Okay, now it is active genetics. No more. So most of the people who are not yet at the stage where they know that there is a super Mendelian also now. Everyone knows about Mendelian genetics. You added it to that active genetics. You made it that. When with all your pros and cons questions, people do talk about that, okay, whenever there is a new discovery or a technology which is so heavy, always comes the questions about what if this happens? And you have faced this all over so many times. When a student, an enthusiast researcher is trying to study something like that, what you suggest to these enthusiasts, that what are the things they should consider before doing something?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, this sort of ethical side of what you do, like, the cloning was a good example. And there was the Asilomar get together where people, asked, well, and there were people from the press there even, and, a whole cross section of people that were, stakeholders, I guess is the way people refer to it now. But, does it make sense to do what you're doing? Even if, you could do it, and even if it could be impactful, that's, and you hope as a scientist that that's all you have to think about. But actually, you do have to think about, as you say, should you do it? So you can do it, should you do it? And, it is a tough one because there are several different ways of thinking about it. First of all, if you don't do it, maybe somebody else will do it.
Mm-hmm.
Will that person who does it do it more or less ethically than you would do it? So if you feel like, you've got the ethical framework to understand how to do it right, and then you don't do it, then somebody else who doesn't necessarily have that background or tendencies might do it in a less good way. I mean, human gene editing is an example where it didn't get an auspicious start, let's put it that way. And so that's an interesting question. And, I think you have to examine each of those on very deeply on a case-by-case basis. But, in the case with Valentino, I remember when we were talking about it in the office, he was thinking about it in the cells of the body, the somatic cells in the body, and, to make a mutant so that you could see a mutant you make the mutant that immediately shows itself as a homozygote, because it's a pain in the neck to get two recessives and cross them. If they're rare, you just hardly ever get them. But we realized then when we were talking about it, I said, well, that's going to go through the germline too. And that's eventually how, we got to testing it as a gene drive. It wasn't our original idea. We were just trying to make mutants. That was the goal. But then when we realized it go through the germline, we go, wow, I mean, that's going to spread, right? So we brought together people from his committee initially, and then, and people from the lab just to, is it the idea solid? Is it a good idea? And so, it was good fortune in his case that just because he had a member on his thesis committee that, worked on mosquitoes and had an ACL2 barrier facility available that he offered Valentino to work in, that he could do it in a way that we were pretty convinced was safe. And even then, Valentino and I spent quite a bit of time figuring out how we're going to put the vials within a Corning tube and then put the Corning tube inside a Tupperware thing and have them all screened and so forth, so that, we're absolutely sure none of those things are going to get out until, we kind of get this all sorted out and have it, also, immediately contacting the people from the biosafety folks and all that kind of thing. So I think being attentive like that is one element of it. But you could still say, well, at the end of the day, should you do it or should you not do it? I mean, there's, even if you can do it, and even if you can do it where you are safely, when other people do it unsafely, and so that was a concern at the time that might happen. And so there isn't a simple answer, but I think the important thing is that people who are doing whatever they're doing, and particularly if they're sort of in the jargon, the gain of function kind of aspect, where you could create something that doesn't yet exist that might do harm as well as good, then you have to be very, very careful about thinking about doing it. And it could well be that an experiment that could get you a high-profile paper is an experiment that might be best not done at that moment. On the other hand, again, if the time is ripe for those kinds of experiments to be done and you don't do them, then you leave the field open for somebody else to do it, because you're not going to control what other people do. And so, and that's a consideration too, because you have to ask, I think, in that, to be fair, well, the whole thing, how would you're doing it kind of square in terms of the social and sensitivity to how other people might do it. And so there's an argument, if you feel that you're paying attention at any rate, that, and you think you can do it safely, and you've got colleagues that agree, then it's a judgment call. All these things are all judgment calls, but the more you think about it, the better off your judgment will be. Let's put it that way. And you should be thinking about it.
Great. So if I have to phrase it in one sentence for all the young enthusiastic researchers there, think deep, be very, very alert and careful, enjoy your science with ethical responsibility. And this is how the science should be done. And for the common audience, now here I would just like to take this second to say that Professor Ethan Bier is one of those scientists who have this consciousness, this responsibility, where there is no need for anyone to come and tell that, okay, have you thought about this? Presently, we have seen that there are scientists who either surpass or take other routes, which are not good for either science or for humanity in a bigger way. But we have to make our choices. As Professor Bier said, that we can do, should we do it or not? This is the question which all the researchers at any of their stage career always should have in their brain. And discussion is the best way to do it. If you're a PhD student, as the story came out that Valentino was a PhD student when this thing started. They had these sleepless nights, which resulted in such a fruitful thing for humanity and for so many other species or fields also in agriculture also they have started. But that is for another episode. For now, we are about to, we have crossed the time, but let's talk about the role of the support systems. So everyone knows that there are stress with researchers. What was your stress buster in your throughout the career?
Well, Raj, I'm not 100% sure I understand that question.
So the question is, every researcher have that stress in their different stages of either in the research, either in their graduate student, postdoc, early faculty, intermediate, senior faculty, when they are doing the research. The stress which comes with research, like work-life balance, which people say, there are stress because of the results, because of the experiments are failing. How did you cope up for over than 4 or 5 decades with that stress?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I don't know how well I've done it, to be honest with you there. Sometimes I wonder whether I've done such a great job in handling that or not. But I guess what it really comes right down to in the end is, how much do you like doing what you're doing? Wow. And if it's a little bit like a marriage to some degree, if you really love what you're doing, it's worth fighting for, right? So if there's some problem, and there are, as you point out, at every stage in the career, all these different stresses, family versus career, that's a stress. And as we talked about before, the practical things of getting funding and so forth, issues that come up in terms of competitors, and there are all kinds of things that come up that you have to deal with. And in the end, it's, if this is what you really love to do, and I think it's hard to argue that you should be a researcher if that's not what you feel, because it is quite a bumpy ride. So you better love it, I think, and so if you do, it's just the same thing as a healthy relationship, then it's worth the bumps to keep it going and to keep it on the tracks, and again, not to ever give up. And I think that's the one thing you have control over. You don't have control over the world or what's going to happen, but you have control how you react to it. You do have that. And your control there is that if you decide that this is something you really want to do, then that's number one in terms of how you deal with the stress. And, you know, you have to be willing, I think, to fall down a few times. And it's not the end of the world usually when things, you know, don't go the way you want them to. Okay, then, you know, you lost the grant, you didn't win on that paper. Okay, too bad. You know, that's not great, but are you still alive? Are you still allowed to go do your work? As long as you can still do your work, just go up there and do it, you know? And I think that's the thing to do, is to have the maturity to understand that anything that's worth doing is going to give you trouble and stress and at some times. And the hope is that the balance of the joy you get from that thrill of discovery, I think that's what it comes down to. It's like discovery is like in a good sense, like an addiction. You know, it's a positive addiction. It's something you just, once you've tasted it, you want it so badly that you'll do what it takes to get it. And I think that is the healthy way to overcome stress. But, you know, to be fair to the broader set of experiences that others may have, sometimes things can get pretty tough for people. And I've seen people in their careers confront stresses that I'm not sure I could have, honestly. So I'm also somewhat lucky, I guess, in that the stresses that I've had to face are ones that I could. I'm not saying I could face every possible stress that could be thrown at me. I've been lucky in my career, honestly, Raj. One of the things that I would have to say is that I'm just a pretty lucky dog as a whole, and have been all the way through, for reasons I don't really know why, but it just, you know, things have kind of gone well at a lot of different points where they might not have. And I don't really know if I've been tested at all those different checkpoints and if things have gone wrong consistently. But I think, to be fair, if for an average trajectory, not everything goes wrong. Okay, not everything goes right, but not everything goes wrong. So I think if you play that kind of, if you kind of get that in your mind to tough it out and to never give up, I think, at least as the way things are today, and with all the fascinating, exciting things there are to discover that yet remain to be discovered, if you dig hard, you'll find stuff. And yeah, you're gonna hit rocks sometimes, but sometimes you're gonna hit gold too, or at least some sellable ore.
These thoughts of Ethan makes him the spark. So now this is for all the audience who are watching this video. The spark when he talks about science is something which I have not seen in many eyes, which Ethan has, this special spark. Only when he's talking science, you can see this entire video multiple times, and you see when he speaks about his research, he is just another person. And when he's not, you see how he is. If we have to compress this entire conversation, what I can tell everyone, and Ethan, correct me if I'm wrong. According to Professor Ethan Bier, if you are enjoying your research, there is no scope for stress. There might be a bumpy ride, but there will be no stress. Did I say it right?
Well, I'd say no stress is perhaps a bit more than I'd say. I'd say the stresses can be overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And that what wins is your passion for doing what you want to do. It's a struggle. It's a struggle that you can win.
Okay. I think this is the best way. Struggle which you can win. So all the researchers, keep doing what you are doing. And if you don't love it, there are so many other options which you can pitch into. Because once you think in your head that you count yourself as a researcher, you want to be known as a researcher. Doesn't matter what or where you are doing. But if you have these two thoughts in your head, then whatever just Professor Ethan said, this should be the key to your success. And we wish all the good success to all the researchers. And we are in debt to say thanks to Professor Bier to take all this time, shared all this positive energy and this wisdom to all the researchers around the world, which they needed. Thank you, Ethan.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.